In 2005, Mexico City was shocked due to the discovery of black suitcases on public roads between the months of October and December. However, just 3 months later, on January 23, 2006, an individual named RAUL Osiel Marroquín Reyes was presented to the media as the probable person responsible for these acts. RAUL Osiel Marroquín Reyes, 25 years old at the time, was a thin man with a penetrating and challenging gaze. Before the media, he mentioned that he did not regret his actions, but rather believed he was doing good for society. He coldly described his modus operandi. Marroquín Reyes was born on September 1, 1980 in Tampico, Tamaulipas. He grew up under the influence of a strict and authoritarian father who constantly abused him. His father had a strong hatred and repudiation of homosexuals, a feeling that Raúl also developed over time. He considered these people as an evil for society. After finishing high school, Raúl entered the army and studied for a year as a military doctor. During his time in the army, he served as a soldier at the Tamaulipas Regional Military Hospital, reaching the rank of First Health Sergeant. However, after 4 years and 7 months, he was discharged from the army. After leaving the army, Raúl showed a change in his behavior. He developed excessive violence and experienced attacks of anger. He had difficulty finding work due to his status as an army deserter, which led him to turn to robbery with violence. In 2004, he was captured and spent a year and 3 months in prison. After his release, he decided to move from Tampico to Mexico City. In Mexico City, Raúl found an apartment at 4223 Andrés Molina Enriquez Street, Interior 2, in the Austria's neighborhood, Venustiano Carranza delegation. He began to frequent the Zona Rosa, known for its nightlife and for being a place frequented by homosexual men. There, Raúl was approached by men who invited him out. In a moment of repressed anger, Raúl decided to become an assassin. In complicity with a friend named Juan Enrique Madrid Manuel, who knew of his plans, Raúl decided not only to murder, but also to obtain money by depriving the victims of their freedom. On October 21, 2005, Raúl and Juan Enrique were in a club and decided to separate. Juan Enrique met a young man named Juan Carlos Alfaro and struck up a conversation with him. After some flirting, Juan Enrique asked Juan Carlos to go ahead and meet Raúl at the Hotel Amazonas. At approximately 2 in the morning, they left the bar and headed to the hotel. Once in room 619 of the Amazonas Hotel, Raúl subdued his victim, mentioning that they were on the 6th floor and that he would throw him out of the window. He also asked for the information of his relatives so that he could request a ransom. Then, he wrapped the young man in blankets and tied him with plastic ties. He stayed like that for a long time, a stormy week, until he realized he was alone in the room. He got up, walked to the door and shouted for help. The hotel staff assisted him and helped him free himself from the belts as soon as he could get rid of them. He then contacted his house to inform them of what had happened and asked his brother for help to bring him clothes, since they had left him without clothes or money at the hotel. When the young man arrived home, they showed him the recordings that Raúl and his accomplice had left the family, demanding 3,000 pesos to free Juan Carlos. The young man's mother tried to negotiate with them, explaining that they were low income and had no money. After failing in their attempt, the criminals considered it too risky to take them to hotels, as they could be easily identified. They decided to take them to their apartment and carefully plan how to do it. So, they made the decision to visit the gay clubs at the same time to attract young people and take them home. Juan Enrique would wait in the apartment to help subdue the victims. In addition, they came up with the idea of placing a wrought iron hook on one of the walls of the apartment room to hang and suffocate their victims. 6 days later, on October 27, everything was ready. That night, Raúl returned to the club and waited for someone to approach him. After observing several people, a 21-year-old man named Jonathan Rosso Ayala approached him. Raúl chose him as a victim due to his physical build. The young man had agreed to meet a friend to enter the club, but since he was delayed, he decided to enter alone. About an hour into their conversation, Raúl invited him to his apartment to hang out. The young man accepted and they left the place together, although they met his friend, who told him not to leave, but he ignored him and decided to leave. When they arrived at the apartment, Raul immobilized the young man by applying a Chinese key. At that moment, Juan Enrique left the room and grabbed the young man's hands and feet. They told him that nothing would happen to him, that he should calm down and be calm. They then took him to one of the rooms, tied him to the bed with ropes and questioned him about his belongings and the financial solvency of his family. They also asked for his personal information and decided to ask for a ransom of 50,000 pesos. That same night, they contacted the young man's relatives and demanded that they deposit the money in their son's account, specifically 4,000 pesos, since the card did not allow them to withdraw more. For 11 days, Raul kept the young man captive, forcing the family to deposit him 4,000 pesos a day. During this time, they allowed him to talk to his father through his cell phone. After 15 days in captivity, they were taken out of the room with the deception of setting him free. However, they covered his eyes with adhesive tape and hung him on a hook, where he remained for about 7 minutes until he died. Then, they covered him with plastic bags, tied him in the fetal position and placed him in a suitcase they had bought days before. At 8 a.m. the next day, they devised a way to get him out without raising suspicions. They put it in the suitcase and one of them came out with a backpack on his shoulder to pretend they were going on vacation. They boarded a taxi that left them 15 blocks ahead. Then they took another taxi to mislead the police and arrived at a subway station. On an overpass on Calzada de Tlalpan, they opened the suitcase, took out the body and left the place. An hour later, the body was found, but no clues were found. To avoid being easily discovered, they reviewed videos of criminal stories committed by alleged sects to learn about the types of marks or clues left on the victims. All this in order to invent some macabre message and mislead the investigating authorities. On Wednesday, November 30, 2005, Raul returned to the same club in the Zona Rosa around 9 at night. He intercepted a subject who gave him his business card from a television company. It was Ricardo Hernandez Lopez, 31 years old, who at that time was accompanied by a friend. After talking for a few minutes, Raul invited him to his apartment. When he arrived, Juan Enrique was already waiting for him. Raul subdued Ricardo with a Chinese key, while his accomplice put shackles on his hands and feet. They then asked him to calm down and provided him with all their information. They contacted Ricardo's relatives, from whom they demanded the amount of 8,000 pesos. The next day, they asked Ricardo to call from his cell phone, telling him to do everything they asked and that it was fine. In that call, they demanded that he deposit 4,000 pesos again, mentioning that this first amount was the beginning of a new amount for his release. They were told that if they couldn't raise that amount, they should mortgage their house. Given the threats and the impossibility of dealing with the situation, the family went to the Attorney General's office to report the incident, where they were assisted by the Federal Investigation Agency. Federal agents came to their home to instruct them in this situation. From Saturday, December 3rd to Thursday, December 8th, relatives received more than 20 calls. 2 days before, Raul went to a bank to open an account in the name of Ricardo Lopez, his victim, and managed to open 3 accounts with the same name without raising suspicions. Afterwards, they called the victim's family again, asking how much money they had raised. Ricardo's father reported that they had only raised 28,000 pesos. Then, Raul gave them the account numbers to deposit the money, assuring them that it would be released that same afternoon. He did it with the phrase that would be the key to identify, sweeping through the afternoon. "I'm going to release it on Friday the 9th. They followed the instructions to release the young man once the money was deposited. However, the captors decided not to release him and proceeded to do exactly the same as with the previous victim. They covered his eyes with tape, put ropes around his neck and hung him until he stopped breathing. This time, they took a razor and made a pentagram on his forehead to make it look like it was some satanic rite. Then, they compacted him in a fetal position, covered him with black plastic bags and placed him in a travel suitcase of the same color. Following the same modus operandi, they took a taxi that took them to the Chabacano subway, then another to Miramontes Avenue, where they left the body inside the suitcase. A woman found the suitcase and when she approached it she realized that it was very heavy, so she decided to call those who found Ricardo's body. The following days the bank transactions of the accounts were reviewed without success, until on December 23 the victim's father saw a note in the newspaper that said, "In a suitcase and 2 bodies," so after going to Semefo they realized that it was indeed his relative. On December 13 of that same year, another victim was deprived of his liberty. It was Jose Ricardo Galindo Valdez. Raul contacted the kidnapper's mother, who implored him not to hurt him because she did not have the money to pay them the ransom. The murderer let him go free, but first threatened to kill him if they reported him. On Friday, December 16, Osiel Marroquín visited the same club again. The house with more victims had gained such experience in the selection of its victims and in the way of approaching them that it occurred to them this time to hook 2 at the same time. First he spoke with a young man named Armando Rivas Perez, who was with a group of friends. The meeting was brief, but lasted long enough to get a phone number and a promise to go to lunch the next day to get to know each other better. He stayed a while longer and then Victor Ángel Iván Gutiérrez approached, with whom he stayed talking for a longer time until he gained his trust. Raul pretended to be romantically interested in him. After that, she invited him to her apartment to spend the night. His accomplice Juan Enrique was waiting with her. Upon entering the property, they both subdued him, took him by the arms and tied his hands and feet. Then they asked for his family's information and called them to ask for money in exchange for releasing him. 15,000 pesos was the amount they requested. The next day they made the deposit and went to the Attorney General's office to report the facts. The next day, December 17, Raul had arranged to meet Armando Rivas. They met at the La Viga Metro at 3 in the afternoon and went to eat at a restaurant. After that, Raul invited him to his apartment. Upon arrival, they used the same modus operandi and took him to a room. In the other was Victor Ángel, since he had been in captivity for 18 hours. They took away his card reader and cell phone and called his family, who at first thought it was a joke and asked to speak to their son. Minutes later, they called his family again and Armando confirmed what they said. Later, they moved the victim to the same room where Victor Ángel was locked up. They tied his hands and feet and covered his mouth with duct tape. On Thursday, December 22, they had already agreed to end their lives, since their accomplice Juan Enrique was going to spend Christmas in Tamaulipas. The first on the list was Armando Rivas and then Victor Ángel. To carry out the act, they covered their eyes with adhesive tape, placed the same rope on them, marked them with a satanic sign and put them in suitcases, dressed in barefoot, in a fetal position, with their heads twisted so that they fit into suitcase. Later, they thought about doing the same. They took the suitcases down to the street, thinking the same as the previous times, to board 2 taxis. Since the suitcases were very heavy, they dragged them approximately 100 meters from their home until they left them next to a planter and returned to their apartment. It didn't take long for the remains to be found. Around 8 p.m., the doorman of the building where they lived reported the discovery to the police, who upon arrival cordoned off the area and began searching for clues. The agents followed the tracks left by the wheels of the suitcase when it was dragged on the sidewalk. Those footprints led them to the building marked with the number 4223 on Andrés Molina Enriquez Avenue to the east of the capital. However, the authorities did not enter to search the apartments, they limited themselves only to taking statements from the neighbors. Days later, they issued a court order to search the building. When they followed the suitcases' wheel tracks carefully, they realized that they were going to lead to an apartment with number 2 and no one answered the door, so they had to force their way in. Inside the apartment they found evidence that the victims were there at some point. They found documents in the name of a subject named Juan Enrique Madrid Manuel, originally from Tampico, Tamaulipas, and another document that was a release ticket from the Preventive Prison Center of Tampico, Tamaulipas, as well as documents that indicated that this person belonged to the Army Mexican, apparently with the rank of sergeant. A pair of gloves used by the meat and food consumption area was also found, in addition to the personal identifications of the victims of Ricardo Lopez and Jonathan Rosso Ayala, as well as the bank cards of the accounts that Osiel Marroquín had opened in the bank posing as Ricardo. They also found 3 phone cards, a photograph of Raúl Marroquín with his ex-girlfriend, a badge that identified Juan Enrique as a paramedic from Ciudad Victoria, and later they found the razor that he used to mark his victims. But there was a problem: their captors were nowhere to be found. After that, they were able to verify that on December 22, Juan Enrique had bought a bus ticket heading to Tamaulipas, so since Thursday night he was no longer seen. Since December 28, they issued a surveillance order at the home and no sign of Raúl Marroquín was found. The only thing they knew was that he was still in the federal district. Today, until January 23, 2006, at 7 p.m., the police saw a suspicious individual who approached them repeatedly, so they got out of the vehicle and went to him, questioning him about his presence at the scene. Telling them that at some time he lived in apartment number 2 in the company of Juan Enrique, and when they asked him to identify himself, he mentioned his name as RAUL Osiel Marroquín Reyes, so they immediately asked him to accompany them, to which he agreed. No problem. For his first crime, Raúl Osiel Marroquín Reyes was sentenced to 60 years in prison without the right to parole until the other murders and kidnappings were proven. However, on February 6, 2010, he was sentenced to 280 years in prison and was transferred to the Santa Marta Acatitla prison for proving said crimes and an illegal of freedom. One more case that will remain in the records of police archives for history. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave me your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos.